All right, let's go ahead and get started today. You should have received an email. I can't remember if I mentioned this on Tuesday or not. You should have received an email about student evaluations. So I would appreciate it if you took the time to fill that out. If you managed to get it done beforehand, that's fine. We can take some time in the last class to do it as well. But just be thinking about that. I would appreciate any comments that you have, positive, negative, places that you thought were really interesting, things that you thought didn't work as well, that need to be changed. I do take them very seriously. I don't always make changes if I have a good reason for doing it, why I do it, but I certainly am open to reconsidering how some things work in the course. So please take the time to complete that. Don't forget as well, several assignments over the next couple of weeks. Tomorrow, the next primary source essay is due. Next week, the Rule of Faith essay is due based on Ferguson's book on Rule of Faith. And then another primary source and summaries assignment due after Thanksgiving. We turn now to looking at developments in culture and society related to Christianity in this latter part of the Middle Ages as we're moving towards the Reformation period. We're winding down. We have two classes next week on Doctrine and Practice, and then we'll have a class after Thanksgiving, kind of point towards the Reformation, and then we'll spend some time reviewing that last class before finals week. So shortly coming to an end here. In thinking about developments in culture and society, there are a plethora of developments in this period in a wide variety of fields. This, of course, is the time period now where we're getting to the Renaissance, and so there are a lot of things related to literature and to art and to architecture and music and all sorts of things related to that time period. We're not going to spend too much time on those things, except where they touch specifically on some things related to Christianity. Where I want to start is by talking about the relationship between the papacy and developing nations. So essentially thinking about relationships between church and state. We mentioned on Tuesday that this is the period where you have many of the modern nation states beginning to develop. And with them, of course, there are the separate monarchies, and they vary in relationship to the papacy, with some being more closely tied than others. I want to talk basically about the relationships between the papacy and England and France. So we'll start with England. Beginning with the Norman conquest of Anglo-Saxons in England in 1066, England's relationship to the papacy was beginning to strain and distance was growing. William the Conqueror, who leads the Norman forces into England, had refused to swear fealty to the Pope, and even the bishops in England found ways to avoid following papal dictates. So even church leaders didn't remain as closely tied to the Pope either. There's the example of Anselm of Canterbury, for example, who flees from England several times because of his allegiance to the Pope. The king had expected that citizens of England, including religious officials, would honor the king, but Anselm refuses. And he also refuses to ordain any kingly appointees as bishops. And so the king wants to be in charge of who becomes bishops, and Anselm refuses. Eventually, England will make a distinction between what rights are accorded to the bishops and what rights are accorded to the king because of things like this. When civil war hits England in the middle of the 1100s, the church believed and felt that they had some independence because monarchy is focused on the war. In the post-Civil War period, however, some of those kings attempted to reassert their previous privileges. They wanted to try and gain the control back over the church. This is reflected in the relationship between Henry II and the man he appoints as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket. Once Becket is established as the Archbishop, though, he immediately becomes a champion for the Catholic Church, for the Pope, which of course disappoints the king. The king tries to force Becket to do what he wants, but Becket refuses and goes into exile. The Pope gets involved in this. He tries to find, is there a way to mediate between these two individuals, but it doesn't work. The king decides he is going to install some bishops in England. Becket decides to excommunicate them. Remember, this is kind of on the heels of some of the things that we talked about previously over investiture and whether or not kings and other local leaders had the ability or the right to establish bishops, with the decision from the church hierarchy being anybody that did so would be excommunicated. So Becket follows through on that. Eventually, though, there is some reconciliation. Becket returns to Canterbury. Henry, of course, hopes that he's going to install his bishops, but he refuses. And so some noblemen will assassinate Becket in his cathedral, right there in the church. The Pope believes that they have been working with Henry, and so he threatens Henry with excommunication. And he will go even further and place the area of Normandy under interdict. Interdict means that the sacraments are not allowed to be performed in that area. And so remember, we mentioned this previously, how the King of England is also the Duke of Normandy, and because of the conquest coming out of Normandy, and so that's why you say to the King of England, well, you can't have sacraments in France. Why would the King of England care? Well, because he's also in charge of this region in France. Becket will be canonized as a saint. Henry, although not excommunicated, will have to do penance. There are other cases of similar types of things. When Richard I goes on the Third Crusade, and he's gone for about 10 years, church leaders felt that they were relatively independent and welcomed them. King John, who kind of takes over during this time, ends up being excommunicated by the Pope because he tries to influence who's going to be in charge of the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Later on, John will kind of repent, become a papal vassal, agree to the church's conditions. When King John signs the Magna Carta in 1215, rather major document for English politics, it gives rights to both the nobility and the church, but the Pope is dissatisfied with it. But that ended up backfiring on him because it only ended up upsetting Catholics in England because the Pope is refusing to essentially support this. England, of course, will gradually move toward a more representative government, the Houses of Parliament, where there is a monarchy, but then there is also this body that is represented. Early on, Parliament was made up of representatives from the lords of the land. But the clergy, who were considered the lords spiritual, had a voice with the other lords. Eventually, though, there would be the House of Commons as well that gave the lower classes a voice in all of this also. When the papacy ends up in France, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, this leads to greater antagonism in England because they have a lot of conflicts with France. The 100 Years' War, of course, is during all of this. Ultimately, all of this puts the Archbishop of Canterbury in a very difficult position because he's in England, but he's also beholden to the Pope. So there's this attempt to try and control papal influence in England. Ultimately, the Pope is accused of filling the ecclesiastical offices in England with foreigners instead of English. And so it seems like the Pope would put in bishops, for example, from other countries as a means to try and control the archbishop and the other bishops, instead of appointing English citizens who would have been more beholden to the monarchy. The situation at around the same time is a little bit different in France. The early French monarchy was rather weak, at least compared to England, where you have a rather strong king. So there wasn't as much of conflict between France and the papacy before about the year 1300. Now again, there's that whole thing with the King of England is also the Duke of Normandy. And so in England he's king, but in France he's a vassal of the King of France. So, so there's some attention because of that. Throughout the later Middle Ages, however, France's power and authority is increasing, and because of the the relationship, the powerful relationship between the Church and France, the papacy decides to lend its support to the French king. Now, centralization of the monarchy, however, led to some autonomy of France from the Holy Roman Empire. But because of its support of the papacy and its relationship with the papacy, France is given some rights that rights over the Church that other places were not given, specifically England. And even before the 100 Years' War, there were smaller skirmishes between England and France, with both sides trying to tax churches out of this, declaring that they're engaged in a just war. In the midst of this, Celestine V resigns as Pope, and Boniface VIII becomes Pope. He will become a rather powerful Pope, or at least make some claims about power. He's accused of manipulating the election, suggesting that some people didn't feel that he was the right choice. Ultimately, he tries to claim some secular power for the Church, protection from political power, and issues a document that forbids any nations and monarchies from collecting taxes from the clergy. Well, that kind of disappoints several people, including King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. He begins to move away from the papacy, and even goes so far as supporting some of Boniface's enemies, confiscating ecclesiastical land, and even throwing a bishop in prison. Well, this further infuriates Boniface, and so he endeavors to make a clear statement of the power of the Church. And so he issues a papal document known as Unum Sanctum, which the Latin translates to one holy church. The term church isn't in the title, but that's essentially what the English would be. Part of the document has to do with encouraging the pilgrimages to Rome, and declares a plenary indulgence, essentially a full indulgence. Your sins will be completely done away with for those who would confess and then make a pilgrimage to the Basilica at Rome in the year 1300. It then would become a policy that it would be true of anyone who traveled to Rome in a year ending in zeros, right? So 1400, 1500, 1600. One of the pilgrims coming at this time is a man named Dante Alighieri, who, seeing some of the merchandising of all of this, becomes very upset at the amount of goods being offered, and that will lead to him incorporating some things in the Divine Comedy that we'll talk about in a little bit. In Unum Sanctum, Boniface attempts to really claim for the papacy universal power and authority. There's only one Catholic Church, he wrote, and outside this church there is no salvation or remission of sins. So you have to be within the church. There's one head to the church, which is Christ, but the Pope is his representative. So there needs to be a recognition of the authority of the Pope. Yes, there are what he refers to as two swords. There is the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. We might think of religious and secular. The spiritual sword is used by the priest. The temporal sword is used by the king, but used under the direction of the church. So the church has the supreme authority. Therefore we declare, wrote Boniface, state, define, and pronounce. You got to say it 4 different ways. I mean, you can't just leave it as declare. That it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And so if you want to be saved, you need to come under the authority of the Pope. Ultimately, he would claim that no human being could judge the Pope. The Pope could only be judged by God. Furthermore, the spiritual sword, the spiritual power, has the right to guide and to judge the secular power. Now, there have been claims like this before, but this is a rather clear, strong claim of the power of the papacy. And as a demonstration of this power, Boniface decides he's going to excommunicate King Philip of France. As a demonstration of how he doesn't have that power, Philip has him kidnapped. He parades him through town in France, humiliated, and he will die shortly after this. After a brief successor who died, the French arranged the election of a pope named Clement V. Clement will then select 23 French cardinals. At this point, the cardinals are now in charge of who decides to become the next pope. 23 of them are now French. Several of them are his relatives. He then decides to move from Rome, where the papacy has been for 1,000 years almost, to the city of Avignon in France.